Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So good to see everyone. Hope you are having a fantastic day so far. My day certainly started well with a bris. What could be better than starting a day with a bris, welcoming a new Jew to the covenant of Abraham Avinu? And so let us begin today's shiur, because one of the concerns that we have as Jewish people is that sometimes we face bias, prejudice, anti-Semitism, discrimination. So what is the Jewish response to that? Now, considering that we are very close to the holiday of Purim, it is just about 2 weeks away. Let's just quickly talk about Purim, because I intend to give a few more shiurim regarding Purim in the coming weeks. So let's just talk about it, because it's a jolly day, a holiday, a wonderful festival. And every year we celebrate it the same exact day, the 14th day in the Hebrew month of Adar. And it commemorates the salvation of our ancestors, of the Jewish people in ancient Persia, in present day Iran, from Haman's plot, which was to, as it says in the Megillah, lahareg or la'abed, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jewish people. Minar v'adzaken, young to old, infants, men, women, children, everyone was to be killed b'yom echad, in one single day, as the Megillah tells us in the scroll of Esther. So this was the plan, the final solution, to annihilate the Jews. Sounds familiar? Well, this has happened many times in our history, that different people came up with the same plan to destroy us. And of course, at the time, the Persian Empire of the 4th century BCE, that was a vast empire. As the Megillah tells us, Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, it was in the times of Achashverosh. Achashverosh, HaMelech Nahoid V'Yad Kusheva Ve'esrim Umeya Medina, which translates, he reigned over 127 countries, lands. This was enormous, a tremendous empire. And all the Jews were their subjects, were subjects of the Persian Empire. And when King Ahasuerus had his wife, Queen Vashti, executed, as we know from the Purim story, because she didn't listen to his orders on how to appear in her birthday suit, well, he arranged a beauty pageant of the time to find a new queen, and we all know what happens, how Esther winds up the new queen who finds favor in his eyes. And so she is the new queen, but she refuses to divulge her true identity, her nationality, that she's Jewish. But at the same time, you had this wicked Haman, who is a Jew-hating anti-Semite, a person who was appointed as prime minister of the empire. And this posed a real problem for the Jews at the time, because Haman despised Jews. And at the same time, the Jewish leader at the time was a fellow by the name of Mordechai, who was the uncle of, or cousin of Haman, of Esther. And he is defying the order of everyone being required to prostrate, to bow down before Haman. So this is what's going on. This is the story, and we know where it goes, because after Haman's being angered and incensed by Mordechai refusing to worship him, he casts lots, and that's in fact where the name Purim comes from. Purim means lots. So he casts these lots, and the day chosen to annihilate, to destroy, to hang Mordechai and to kill the Jews was the day that today we celebrate as Purim, the 14th of Adar. Mordechai, in the meantime, he galvanized all the Jews. He told the people that it's time to repent, time to change from their ways. After all, the doors of heaven are never closed. God will always accept our true, heartfelt, sincere, genuine prayers. And so Jewish people began to fast, pray to God, and do everything that Mordechai required. In the meantime, he asks Esther back in the palace to join, to be part of this effort. And in fact, he poses a very tough proposition to her, where he says to her, when she's a little bit flaky, she's not sure, she's not certain, and he says, why do you think you're in this position? And I think it's a question we sometimes have to ask ourselves, generally speaking. Why do we find ourselves in any particular position? For what reason? There's always a reason. And if we are in whatever situation it might be, there's a divinely ordained reason for it. And we have to seize the opportunity that we have. And so that's what he did. He convinced Esther to do her part as well, which ultimately led to the salvation of the Jewish people, where she invited Haman to one party and then to a second party. And eventually she revealed the news to Achashverosh that Haman is plotting to kill her and her people. That's when she had to reveal her identity. And we know the end of the story. Haman was hanged. Mordechai was appointed as the prime minister instead. And a new decree was issued, granting us the right to defend ourselves against the enemies, which is interesting. Instead of reversing the decree, we were given the right to defend ourselves. That's the way it was once upon a time. You needed a right to defend yourself. So in 2 weeks' time, on Thursday evening and Friday, we're going to commemorate this. We're going to celebrate what happened then on the 13th day of Adar, about 2,400, 2,500 years ago, when the Jewish people defended themselves. And this is Purim. Until this very day, we have to stand strong and keep defending ourselves. And let's talk a little bit about what it takes to defend ourselves. Throughout our history as a Jewish people, there have been many, many incidents of anti-Semitism, of hatred, times when we were attacked once and again, where those who wanted to come up with a final solution to do away with us, yet we're still here. Not only did we survive, but thank God we indeed thrive. And so let's just analyze a little bit of that story and see what messages and lessons we could glean from the story to apply to our own lives as well. And, to find the connection to ourselves. So I want to just look at one particular verse here in the Megillah, which stands out. Because if we look in Megillas Esther, we see the story as it unfolds as Haman, who's the prime minister, and he makes a short but very powerful presentation to his superior, to Achashverosh, to convince him why he has to do away with the Jewish people, why he should embrace Haman's plan of genocide. Let's read the verse. It's right here in front of you. Vayomar Haman lamelech Achashverosh. Haman said to King Achashverosh, Yeshna am echad, there is this one certain nation, mefuzar umefarad ben ha'amim, who are scattered and separated among the peoples. There's obviously different explanations of what this means. Does it mean just that we're dispersed, that we're everywhere? Jewish people can be found anywhere you go? Or another way to understand it, and maybe this is the cause of our downfall, was that we were mefuzar umefarad, that we were separated, that we were splintered, that we were not together. That's another way of understanding this. V'dasehem shanos mikalam. But here is the clincher of Haman's words, Haman's argument. He says that these people are different from everyone else. Their laws differ from every other people. They don't follow the laws of the king. And it is not worthwhile for the king to keep them. So therefore he says to Achashverosh, if the king pleases, Yikosev le'abdam, then please let it be decreed for them to be destroyed. And not only that, says Haman, I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents to pay for this extermination. You think a Holocaust is cheap? To build concentration camps and gas chambers and to send people in cattle cars? Granted, it's only cattle cars they sent them with, but you think that was cheap? The same thing here. Haman says, don't worry about it. And if you're concerned about the taxes that you're going to lose out, don't worry, I could sort out the tax issue as well. I'll pay for their annihilation. So Haman makes this offer to the king, and as you can see it right here, his words straight up to Achashverosh. But what stands out to me, all the different aspects of what Haman says, this particular message, very straightforward, very clear. He's saying that we are different. The Jews are different. They're alien, they're outsiders. They are an obstruction to normal society. They don't fit into the rest of your kingdom, of your people. They have their own faith, their own laws. And perhaps they feel superior. And don't we say in our prayers, we say God chose us of all the nations. Now, this is not a superiority complex when we say that. God chose us to give us the Torah. Everyone's chosen for their purpose, but Haman was presenting this Jewish supremacy idea. And he's basically saying they're a nuisance, a threat, a growth, as the Nazis called us, a parasite. And basically, they are not worthwhile to keep. They don't integrate into society. Time to get rid of them. That was Haman's presentation to King Achashverosh. And the Talmud actually discusses this. The Talmud tells us that describing Haman's presentation with a little bit more detail, the Talmud weaves this narrative through the words of what Haman says, just to dissect it, to analyze it a little bit. V'daseim shonos mikalam. Right here you have it in front of you. The laws are different from all the other people. Says the Gemara that they don't, what makes them different? The Gemara says that they don't eat from our food. Yeah, kosher. You always have to be different. What else? They don't marry our people. This is the Talmud's explanation of how the Jews were different. And remember the next words. They don't keep the king's laws. They waste the whole year avoiding the king's work. They have excuses. Today is Shabbos, the next day is Yom Tov, it's Pesach, it's Shavuos, it's excuses why they don't have to work on the days that we do have to work. Has anyone ever encountered these types of complaints today? Well, this is 2,500 years ago, same story. And Haman also discusses other negative behaviors of the Jews. Let me pick it up here in the Gemara. It says, it's therefore of no use for the king to keep these people who are so different. What a nuisance. Says the Gemara, they eat, they drink, they disgrace the throne. Even if a fly falls into the wine, as you can see here in this picture, right? What's the law? Are we allowed to eat flies? No. Halachically speaking, the Torah says insects aren't kosher. So Haman says they'll cast away the fly, but they'll drink the wine. But if my master, the king, complains, Haman to Achashverosh, touches the wine glass of one of them, then they won't drink the entire glass, which is a concept in halacha called yayin nesach. And the reason for this, as it's explained in the Talmud, is it's forbidden to derive any benefit from wine of idol worshippers. Okay, this is a concept. You don't know who is or isn't an idol worshipper. So the Talmud says we don't drink wine that isn't kosher. I mean, essentially, it's the same ingredients for kosher wine and non-kosher wine. The only difference is if it is used for idol worship, a Jew is not allowed to consume it. And considering that we don't know for what purpose it was made, therefore we don't use any wines that were not produced under kosher supervision. Of course, the laws of kosher wine are a little bit more complex than that. I've oversimplified it, but that's the point. So Haman is arguing to King Ahasuerus. He's saying, look at these people. They see themselves different, superior. They're always going to stand out. Who needs them? That's Haman's complaint. And if you think about this, this is a concept that has repeated itself over and over and over again. Not just in modern times, but as you can see throughout history. Very interestingly, around the time of the temple's destruction, or a little bit later, I should have picked this up for you here, but let me just share this. There was a philosopher in Athens, and I think also in Rome. And let me just find what he said that I could share with you. Okay, let me just read it to you because I don't think I put it into the slide. He says, the Jews have long been in revolt, not only against the Romans, but against humanity. And a race that has made its own life apart and irreconcilable, that cannot share with the rest of mankind in the pleasures of the table, nor join in the libations or prayers or sacrifices, are separated from ourselves by a greater gulf than divides us from Sura or Basra or of the more distant Indies. Okay, so just interesting that this is something that this argument is used in one form or another, time and time again, constantly repeated thousands of times throughout history. And whether you're going into ancient Rome or to ancient Persia, wherever it was, over and over, they say the same thing. Another quote, the Jews regard as profane all that we hold sacred. On the other hand, they permit all that which we abhor. Toward every other people, they feel only hate and enmity. They sit apart at meals and they sleep apart. And although as a race, they are prone to lust, they abstain from intercourse with our women. You hear the complaints against us. You know, over and over, you see this conflict between the different cultures that had these complaints about us. Or here's another one. The Jews regarded a crime to kill any newborn infant. You know, the Romans and the Greeks as well, I think, they had this infanticide. They would kill any infants who were born, whether mentally or physically handicapped. They were not worthwhile. And the Nazis had the same thing. They wanted a pure race. And the fact that Judaism forbids murder of anyone, regardless if a child's born into this world, by God's decree, will do anything to keep them alive. That today, even though it's common, it's universal, back then, it was considered the Jewish thing that was peculiar, strange, and it wasn't the normal thing. In their minds, keeping such children alive was absolutely pointless. It was unaesthetic. It served no purpose. Didn't make sense. So let's go back to the story of Purim. We have Haman, who's the viceroy, is the prime minister, and his arguments persuade King Ahasuerus to allow the annihilation of the Jewish people. A decree is issued from the Persian throne, and that's it. The decree is made. On the day that the lots were cast on Purim, the 13th to 14th of Adar, every Jewish man, woman, and child was going to be exterminated on that day. That's what Purim means, that the lots were cast for the 13th of Adar. And then we know what happens. In this delightful turn of events, First Lady, the Jewish Queen Esther, she invites her husband, the king, and the viceroy, the prime minister Haman, to a feast. And as we recall, Esther, from all the thousands of young women who were brought from across the entire empire, as potential candidates to be the queen in this beauty pageant, it was Esther who found favor in the eyes of the king. It was Esther, the one who he chose, right? And the Megillah tells us these words, that Vayav Melech Esther, that the king loved Esther from all the women, from all the virgins, and she won more favor in his eyes and more grace than all the other women. And of course, he set the royal crown on her head, as the Megillah tells us. But years later, here we're reading about this feast, and the king pledges to Esther, whatever you want, ad chatzi malchus v'seyas, up to half the kingdom, he says, I'll do for you whatever you want. Okay? This is Esther's chance. And she jumps in. And Queen Esther, I don't have my Megillah in front of me. I hope I'm using the right cantillation. And she says to the king, if I found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, may my life be given to me in my petition, and my people in my request. She's pleading with the king. She says, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to be purged, to perish. She says, and if had we been sold as slaves or as bondswomen, Hecharashti would have kept silent. But no, for the adversary has no consideration for the king's law. So you can imagine, Esther is coming to King Ahasuerus here, broaching this topic. He's probably not knowing what she's talking about. He doesn't know that she's Jewish. So on the one hand, she's coming as a personal note here. I'm your wife. I'm your queen. And I'm included in this decree of those who have to be annihilated, right? So she's exposing her Jewish identity to him. And then she's talking from an economic perspective. She's saying, well, you want this people, my nation, to be condemned to death. So she says that, it's not worth it for you. Imagine all the taxes you're going to lose if you destroy this people. So she's coming from two sides. First, she says, personal, you want to lose your wife? And secondly, economically. By selling the Jews as slaves, she says, it would be far more worthwhile than exterminating us. How much is Haman offering you? He's giving you a temporary financial payout to destroy us. Now, Ahasuerus, up to this point, has no clue that Esther's a Jew. Well, we know the end of the story. He has Haman executed, and the decree is subverted. That's the story, my friends. Have a great day. No, we all know what happens. The whole climate then in Persia changes. From this story of realizing that their queen is a Jew, and everything that happens from here. Someone have a question? No? Okay. Just heard some noises. But there is a question that comes to mind. Haman didn't argue the case for exterminating the Jewish people on the base of just his hatred, of his senseless, venomous passion. He presented what the king considered a really sound and persuasive case. He argued that we are, Yeshnat Amechad, Mefuza, Mefara, Ben Amim, word, alien growth a bizarre, strange people, a separatist nation, third column, what do they call it? Fifth column, I forget the term. So he's describing us as supremacists. You can't tolerate this fifth column in your empire. And that's a very strong accusation. And Ahasuerus accepted it. And that's why the decree was made that he could destroy this nation who are so different. But nowhere in the entire dialogue with him and Esther does he actually refute this argument. It's very strange what happens. Is he such a drunk that he first gets, strange guy. First, he kills his first wife on the advice of his advisor, of his prime minister. Then he kills the prime minister on the advice of his wife. What's with this guy? Why did Ahasuerus annul the decree if he first was persuaded and believed what Haman said about the Jewish people, that we are this fifth column? Now you might argue that Esther's charm, her grace was just what changed his heart. He was so enthralled, enamored by her. But it's clear that Esther does not just rely on herself. She doesn't just say that I stand to be destroyed. That's why she presents this logical argument. She says it would be more worthwhile to enslave the people than to just annihilate them, genocide. So she refutes Haman's economic offer by showing that it's not worth it for you. The taxes that you gain, you have more to gain by keeping the Jewish people. But how could she ignore Haman's argument about what makes us so different? Why Haman wants this Judenrein society that others have also argued for in our history. So what about answering Haman's arguments? And before we explore Esther's response, or her lack of it, let's see how similar terrible accusations were addressed in the history of us as a Jewish people, because we have a long history and many times these incidents have happened over and over again. So I want to go back in time to the drama and intrigue in the court of Louis IX. He was the king of France in the year 1240. And I'm actually sharing with you something I read in a talk of the Rabbi. And he talks about this particular incident. It's an interesting story in history. And a sad one, because the story goes to an individual named Nicholas Donin of La Rochelle. He was actually a Jew who converted to Christianity in the early 13th century in Paris. And the custom amongst Jews at the time when someone were to behave in this fashion was cherem, an excommunication from the Jewish ghetto by Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. And the whole community knew that this fellow who converted out of the Jewish faith was excommunicated. After about 10 years of living in excommunication, even though he still was holding on to his Judaism to some degree, he was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church and he joined the, whatever they call it there, the Franciscan order. And his first act of retaliation against the Jewish community for excommunicating him was to stir up bands of crusaders to sadly perpetrate a massacre amongst many Jews. And this is very, very sad, where one of our own who left the faith. And sadly, you could think about the founder of Christianity was one of our own as well. And we've really suffered throughout history from them. And the proposal he made to the community was baptism or else. And then in 1238, Dunin went to Rome. He presented himself before the Pope, and he publicly denounced the Talmud. 35 articles were drawn up in which he charged that the Talmud contains various attacks against the virginity of Mary, the divinity of the Christian Savior, and a lot of whatever else. And the Pope was persuaded that these accusations had merit. And so he dispatched transcripts of the charges that were made by Dunin to the church officials, along with an order to seize all copies of the Talmud, and there were public burnings in the squares of France, of Paris, and everywhere else, with Talmuds being burned left and right. Don't forget, in those days, a book of Talmud, this is before, I think it's before the printing press came around, and so here you had scrolls of the Talmud, handwritten scrolls being burned left and right. Now, you can imagine what's going on to the Jewish people, where you have to surrender your books of Talmud. This was a very, very difficult time. And after that, they ordered 4 of the very distinguished French rabbis, including Rabbi Yechiel of Paris and 3 other great rabbis, to a public debate where they were supposed to answer these accusations. Now, the rabbis stood here trying to defend Judaism, but they knew this was a very common occurrence back in those days, that regardless how justified and right you were, you still lost. And they kept burning books of Talmud. One day, 24 carriage loads of handwritten Talmudic works were set ablaze. One of the critical texts that was cited as evidence that the Talmud derides the Gentiles in France was something the Gemara says in the name of the great Tana, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He says, even the best of them during the war shall be killed. Look at that, they said. What a bombshell. There you go, compelling proof that the Jews, we harbor this intense hatred to the Gentiles. It's irrefutable. How would you answer this? Clearly in your Talmud it says, in a time of war, that to kill them all, even the best of them. So Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who was now on the stand and had to defend this, here's what he said. He said there are 2 different types of goyim in the words of the sages. The Talmud says the goyim. What does this mean? All Gentiles? Is that you think what the Talmud means? Let me read to you the words of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. He says, the heretic raised his voice and exclaimed, you are wicked, for you have permitted spilling Gentile blood. Did not the rabbi say even the best of them should be killed? That was Dunin's complaint. And Rabbi Yechiel responded, with your many words, your sins do not cease. And now I'll address your former claims and lay rest to your latter ones. Know that the word goy, which is what you're translating as Gentile, has both negative and positive connotations. A positive reference can be found in the verse that says, Shabachu, what's the verse again? Hallelujah Hashem kol goyim shabachu kol umim, where we say, praise Hashem, all the nations, right? All the peoples. They're obviously very positive. And of course, as negative, we also find reference where it says in the Torah, kol goyim shchech elikim, may the wicked return to the grave, all nations who forget God. The same one word, but it has 2 meanings, 2 different contexts. So Rabbi Yechiel of Paris was explaining the idea that if you look at the words of the Talmud, firstly, he says only in a time of war is it that we're defending ourselves even amongst the best of them. But it's not that Jews are to hate non-Jews, even good ones, as you're trying to portray it. Rather, if there are people fighting you, even if they seem to have redeeming qualities, they have a good persuasive argument, the very fact that they are fighting, that they're waging a war, is proof of their hatred. Think of the past generation of the Nazis, Yamach Shemam. Were they not intellectually supreme people, doctors, professionals? But if their imperative is to kill, then we stand in defense of ourselves, even if it's the best of them. And Rabbi Yechiel offered some words from the Talmud as further explanation, going back to the story of our ancestors in Egypt, which we've been discussing in the past weeks. So let me read to you interesting what he takes from the Mechilta. The Mechilta says, what does it say, Vayikach sheishmeos rechev b'chor, when it talks about Pharaoh taking the 600 select chariots? Says the Mechilta, whose animals were pulling the chariots? If you suggest there were the Egyptian animals, it says clearly, after the splitting of the sea, the Egyptian cattle died. In the plagues. If you suggest that they belong to Pharaoh, well, it says, behold, the hand of Hashem will be upon your livestock that is in the field. If you suggest that it was our Jewish property, it says, and also the cattle will go with us, not a single hoof will remain. So when they came pursuing us, when we were between the Red Sea and Egypt, and the Egyptians were chasing after us, what animals were pulling the chariots? Says the Gemara, it must mean that these animals belong to the ones who feared God. And therefore the Talmud concludes that not all Egyptians were punished in the plagues, only those who were the evil ones. Yet, when the Egyptians lost their workforce, all the Jewish slaves left, and now Pharaoh needed to pursue us, they took their animals to lead their chariots. So the Gemara is bothered by the question, where the Egyptians got these horses from? Well, it concludes that it was from the God-fearing, the better Egyptians, so to say. Those believing individuals, they brought their animals indoors when Moshe said at the time that the plague was going to come, meaning they feared God, they listened to Moshe, and that's why their horses were spared. And therefore, the Talmud saying that even they were rotten and were willing to give their horses to pursue us, to kill us after we left Egypt. So Rabbi Yechiel of Paris declared that even the good ones should be killed. What does it mean? We're talking here in a time of war where they're pursuing us, where they're coming to kill us. Then he says, the Talmud is telling us it's imperative that we rise up, we defend ourselves from even the good ones who want to kill us. Even the ones who might be God-fearing. So, besides for that, said Rabbi Yechiel, we know it's a basic tenet of Judaism that we're forbidden to harm in any way, whether financially or personally, even a hair's breadth of anyone, of any human being. The Torah teaches us how we're meant to treat animals with sensitivity, with care, how much more so a fellow human being. When the Talmud says to kill the best of them, what is it talking about? Very clearly it's talking about in a time of war. So he stood there defending the Jewish position. And he said very clearly, we have no bad feelings to any of our countrymen. In fact, we live very peacefully alongside with many of our wonderful Gentiles who host us in this country. And in fact, it's part of Jewish prayers that we every day pray for the welfare of the country. We conduct business, we do things. That's the Jewish way. Now, unfortunately, he wasn't given a fair chance. And despite his persuasive arguments, he unfortunately didn't succeed in preventing terrible decree. And they continued burning books of Talmud. They continued in their anti-Semitism. The Crusades killed thousands of Jewish people. Unfortunately, that was the case. So Rabbi Yechiel didn't win this one. But at least we have his response. Hopefully, I guess eventually, today Jews live in France, and I think they live well in France, even though there's still anti-Semitism there. But at the time, he wasn't persuasive enough, even though he had a compelling argument. But what about Esther? Don't forget, we aren't going to get caught up, Why didn't she say anything to counter Haman's argument? Haman is giving this persuasive argument, how different we are, how we're not worthwhile to keep. Why does she only rely, so to say, on her charm, on her good looks? She talks about herself. You want to lose your wife? That's pretty much the argument that she presents to Achashverosh, to her husband. So in 1969, at a Farbrengen on Purim, as America was intensely involved in the space race with Russia, and there was other things going on then, the struggle of civil rights and social freedoms and other major issues, the Rebbe gave a talk, a Farbrengen, a discussion in 770, and we have that talk. In fact, I could even put on the video for you. And the Rebbe gave a very passionate address, and he spoke with enthusiasm, with tremendous zeal, and he used the Megillah and its storyline to tell the important lessons of what it means to be a modern Jew today. And I think those words that he said 50 years ago, 52 years ago, ring true today as it did then. And I'll just share with you a few of his thoughts. He spoke about this Purim story and the silence in the face of Haman's argument. He asked, where is Esther's answer? She doesn't seem to answer Haman's accusation. But the Rebbe explained that, some questions are resolved by answers, and some arguments are refuted with counter arguments, but there are beliefs, there are notions that no debate or dialogue can actually disprove them. Reality does the job. When reality is exposed, then the arguments dissolve. Haman's allegations are part of that category. Esther responded to Haman's argument for the Jewish genocide, not by dialogue, but by her sheer presence. The moment she identified herself, she told her husband, I am a Jew. All of Haman's arguments disappeared, they vanished. The mere fact that Achashverosh sees a Jew. Achashverosh knew Esther intimately. She was his wife. He sensed her soul. He touched her grace. He cherished her personality. As one would, he adored his wife, her charm. He would want to do anything for her, and he says it. He knew that Esther's character, her values were noble, were dignified, were pure. And so we know he chose her from all the thousands of contestants, of all the other young women who came before him. who probably most of them were not Jewish. The Megillah tells us the story of the beauty contest. But Achashverosh never realized that she was Jewish. He had no clue. Now Esther told him, Achashverosh, my good man, you know me. The woman you love more than anyone else, you chose me out of everyone. Well, guess what? I am from that nation that this Haman suggests hates you. Really? I'm one of those hateful, dissentful Jews who plot to harm you, to undermine your empire? How preposterous, you know me. How could you think so? That was Esther's way of countering the argument. She didn't have to argue this. She didn't even have to say this. When she said she's Jewish, he of course knew that these accusations are false. She didn't have to articulate it. So when he discovers that she's a proud member of the Jewish nation, he realized how false those arguments of Haman were. This wasn't about dialogue or argument. She didn't have to answer the accusation. Her mere presence, Esther's day-to-day life demonstrated louder than any argument could ever achieve how absurd Haman's accusation, his threat, his argument about the Jewish threat to society. When King Ahasuerus looked at Esther, his wife, he knew her refinement, her beauty, not just superficially. He understood that this whole accusation of the Jewish people is wrong. It may be different, but it's an otherness that elevates others, that doesn't threaten. And the same can be applied to us. We might be different. Yes, we keep Shabbos, we keep kosher, but this isn't something that is in any way a superiority over the others. We don't try to instigate hatred. We work with the world, we live, we demonstrate how to love, how to live productive, meaningful lives, contributing to society through our faith in God. And so when Ahasuerus learned that Esther's special quality was actually a symptom of her Jewishness, he didn't need anything more to hear. He got it. The last thing he wanted was to lose such a people from his kingdom. And that was it. The decree was annulled. So this, I think, is a very, very powerful point that is a lesson for each one of us. Sometimes we think that we're going to hide our differences, we're going to hide our otherness, so people we could assimilate into society will gain the approval of the world around us. But that didn't work. In fact, some reason, late last night, early this morning, I was reading a dissertation by someone, thesis, talking about pre-World War II Jewry in Poland. And it was actually my grandmother's yard site, so that's how I got engaged in this, and describing what Jewish life was like there. We were 10% of Polish society, 3 million Jews out of 30 million citizens in the country. And boy, were we a melting pot of all different types. And many tried to marry out. Many did marry out. Many lost their faith. Didn't help them. The facts prove that it doesn't help us. Assimilation, trying to hide our unique identity as Jews, not keeping Shabbos kosher, whatever makes us stand out as a Jewish people, has never in any way assuaged anti-Semitism. In tradition tells us that the Jews of Shushan was the capital of the Persian Empire in the time of the Purim story. They were very assimilated. Talmud tells us that they were very content to be part of the party that Ahasuerus threw. Many of them took part in the party. The Gemara discusses this actually, and the Gemara asks a question, why were the enemies of Israel? And actually the Gemara says there's a euphemism, so to say, of some of us Jews, worse than the outside anti-Semite that's identifiable is the trouble we get from our own sometimes. Why were they deserving of extermination, the Gemara asks? For what reason? And the Gemara explains, because they lost their identity. They wanted to be like everyone else. They made every effort to assimilate into the culture of the time. They made sure the king is throwing a party, let's be there, let's hang out, let's be cool, let's be like everyone else. But it still did not deter the Persian Prime Minister Haman or the king from believing Haman's allegations against us. We were strange, different, all that. And this is about the assimilated people. And this pattern just kept repeating itself throughout history. The same thing over and over and over again. We have it over and over again. Jews in Germany, many of them were very highly assimilated, were just like the rest of society. They were fully integrated into the mainstream, but it didn't help them. No matter how married out one was, no matter how intelligent, whatever they were. And even the good ones, certainly there were good people, there were righteous Gentiles who saved us, who saved and hid many Jews. But my father was there then. And he told me that riding a bike, my father was there after the war. During the war, he was in Russia and Uzbekistan, but he came there after the war, and he described to me the hatred that still existed there. It was there. And to this very day, we just have to do whatever it takes to stand strong, to stand tall, not to forget who we are. Today, many people believe that we're responsible for all types of things. You hear the anti-Semitism that exists, blaming us for COVID-19, blaming us for other problems in the world. And as much as we attempt to run away from our identity, it doesn't help. We just have to stand tall, stand strong. This week we read about God giving us the Torah at Mount Sinai, continuation from last week's Parsha. We've got to be like the mountain, tall and proud of who we are. And that, I think, is the solution for us. Our answer to the prejudice of the world is not to deny our identity. You can't start asking every person, everyone has to become one equal race in the world. Nonsense. Every person ought to be proud of who they are, of our race, of our skin color, and the beauty of the Jewish people, of how we are so diversified. Anyone could join the Jewish nation if they choose to do so sincerely and genuinely. And we Jews come in all stripes, shapes, colors, you name it. We can't hide our identity. But like Esther, we have to be proud of who we are. Esther revealed her identity to the king. We also, no reason to have that shame or guilt, but it should be a source of pride, of something that people would admire. And in fact, we have to make sure that we're inspired. And with that, we can share that with the rest of the world. Just like Esther, we have to share that beauty, the love, the dignity that Torah teaches us. And you don't have to preach because it speaks for itself. The grace of Torah's lifestyle, that the integrity, the sanctity, our dedication to God, all the aspects of it, modesty and the moral code, all that it's not a speech. It's the way we have to live. And that love for humanity that we learn from our studying of Torah becomes the reality of our life. As Reb Chaim of Volozhin once remarked, he said, if a Jew doesn't make Kiddush, and what does it mean to sanctify God's name, then the non-Jew will have to make Havdalah for him. Havdalah is the end of Shabbos. Havdalah also means to distinguish. Well, if we don't stand out ourselves for what's uniquely us, then others will do it for us. And I think I'd like to conclude with a little story, speaking of my grandmother. She told me the story in her childhood, the way in Russia, Oh, sorry, just a second, guys. What's going on here? Give me a moment. Okay, not sure what's happening. She told me that back in Russia, she grew up during the beginning of communism. She was born just before communism came into, and there was a teacher who tried to prove to the class that God doesn't exist. So the teacher took them outside and she shows the kids, look up at the sky. You see the sky, you see the birds, you see the trees, but you don't see God. It's proof that God does not exist. One of the kids turned to the teacher and said, well, teacher, we see your beautiful dress, we see your face, but we don't see your brain. This is proof that you don't have a brain. Well, not everything can be seen. Not everything can be proven in that way. Not everyone can see God. But in our parsha, we actually read how the Jewish people saw God. They saw. They ate and they drank. And some of the commentaries wonder, is that appropriate? Is it respectful? You see God and then you eat and you drink? Is that the way you behave? And Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, gave a beautiful interpretation. He says, indeed, Judaism is meant to be real. You see God, you got to make God part of your life, part of your eating and drinking. Eating and drinking exemplifies, personifies, demonstrates one of the most basic behaviors of a human being. We eat and drink, right? Says Rabbi Dov Ber that this is so important that indeed they did eat and drink, because that's what you do. You make Judaism real and part of your life. A few weeks back, I saw in a magazine, they asked a question. Who would you like to have dinner with? Any person who existed in the past or present. And they got like 30 different responses. They asked popular people. And they asked a whole lot of different people, including Rabbi Reuven Feinstein, who recently passed away from COVID. So this is just shortly before he passed away. He's a rabbi from New York. It's a New York magazine that I was reading this in. And so there were different answers. I saw one person said, oh, I would love to have dinner with Nelson Mandela. Another person said, I'd love to have dinner with the Rebbe. Another person said, with Moshe Rabbeinu, different answers. And they were all nice, each one selecting another great personality who existed or exists today. Someone else said they would love to sit and have dinner with Donald Trump and Joe Biden together. All wonderful answers. But then I saw Rabbi Reuven Feinstein's answer. He said, I would like to have dinner with a poor person who has nowhere else to have dinner. That was his answer. And I think that's what personifies the idea of what it means to make, you see God, make it part of your life. Make it real. That's Judaism. What Rabbi Reuven Feinstein said, to have dinner with somebody who didn't have an invitation from anyone else. In fact, I was scrolling on Facebook recently and I saw somebody's post and said, Purim is coming up in 2 weeks. Make a list of all the people you need to give Shalach Manas gifts to. And now delete that whole list and give instead to the people who didn't make it onto your list. So with that, my friends, I will conclude today's shiur. Remember to stand proud and tall of who you are as a Jew. No need to forget our true identity. Be proud of it. Stand tall and have a great day. Carpe diem. Any questions before we go? Sei gesund, everyone. See you soon.